So what I thought I would do is rather than, we're going to go through this letter line by line, and I thought rather than just me saying, my own experience with it, I am not an economics expert or, I don't have a lot of background in that area. So I asked my two friends, Jeff Wassel and John P. Capitalist, to join me in this, and they were all more than happy to. So hi guys, thanks for doing this with me.
Hey Chris, pleasure to be with you again.
Yes.
And I'm glad to be making my debut on your podcast, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I am like I mentioned before when we were talking, I was so happy to finally put a face with the voice and all the great work you've done, John. It's been you've done some really championship work in breaking down certain aspects of Scientology's financials and the economics of it that I would never have been able to figure out otherwise.
Well, thanks. Flattery will get you everywhere, Chris. Thank you.
Excellent. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read, we're going to go through this letter paragraph by paragraph, and then I will get feedback from Jeff and John on what their thinking is about what Hubbard is telling President-elect Reagan at this time. And again, this was dated 28 November 1980. Dear Sir, I am writing you because I very much want to see you make it. Inflation was apparently the key issue which swept you in. There is a way to handle it, and then this word is a little hard to read. It could be survive, it could be succeed.
The big thing that really propelled Reagan in many ways, in addition to inflation, was the whole nightmare of the 440-day Iranian hostage crisis.
I remember that, and I was 10 years old.
Yeah, the geopolitics of the time were very, very convoluted, and there was a lot of anger about the way Carter behaved, and I say this apolitically. I mean, that's just the way the country was feeling. Mm-hmm. I was a Reagan-era Cold Warrior. I was in at the time, and it was a very uncertain time, especially considering the Russian activity in Afghanistan. So inflation just compounded, I think, the general sense of angst in the country. I think there was a lot of, people were looking for guidance, and the whole, it's the campaign that he used, it's a new day in America, was very effective. He had a very effective political ad at the time that really kind of set the tone about, this is let's get rid of what's happened. Let's move forward. And inflation was at almost 13% at the time. It's one of these things that I think was a combination of many things. And Hubbard, in his typical way, has just broken it down into something that is more germane to him than looking at the greater good, right?
Yeah. So let's think about this whole inflation thing. For people that are not our age, inflation is kind of a theoretical construct because we've had a very benign environment for price inflation in the U.S. and most of the G20 countries. But in the 1970s, inflation was a big deal. And as Jeff says, inflation was running around 13% a year. So every year, the price of stuff you needed went up by 13%. And it's very stressful when that happens as a consumer because you've got to hope that you're going to get a big enough raise to do that, to keep buying whatever you need to feed your family, put gas in the car, and so forth. There had been a number of spectacular failures under administrations throughout the 70s. Nixon had what is called a wage price freeze. This is almost inconceivable today. He decreed that, I think it was for 90 days or 120 days, you couldn't raise prices of anything and you couldn't raise wages for anything. This is almost today the sort of thing you would expect to see in Venezuela and similar hellholes. But that was about the state of the art in economic policy. So inflation was a big problem. And the other thing that happens when inflation goes up is that interest rates go up as well. And so at the same time that inflation was 13%, the rate for a mortgage was 20%. Now, if you look at it today, you can get a 30-year mortgage for somewhere around 4% plus or minus, depending. And the notion that you'd have to pay 20% meant that the mortgage payments were staggeringly unaffordable for most people, especially when they were worried about inflation. So the housing market, people felt trapped. It was a very, very stressful time. And inflation was not just a problem in the U.S., it was also a problem in the U.K. and in much of Europe. So, people who are coming of age in the last 20 years just don't understand what a big deal this was. Carter's response to inflation was not successful. And so that was a big factor in why Reagan, with a message of sunny sort of optimism, was able to win in a landslide against an incumbent president. And so, the idea, Hubbard's calling it correctly here when he says inflation was apparently the key issue which swept you in. And yes, the geopolitical situation, as Jeff pointed out, with the Iran hostage deal, that was also a big deal.
And also, we were coming off the OPEC had just started flexing its muscles too. Don't forget. So you had the whole oil crisis that really hammered the global economy. So I think it was a perfect storm in many ways.
Okay, good. Well, the point I wanted to give that context for was because L. Ron Hubbard didn't care about any of that stuff. I mean, he was very insulated and isolated in his own little world, and Scientology was actually, at this time, Scientology was at its peak as far as I'm concerned, as far as all the information I have about numbers and number of people who were in Scientology and how Scientology was doing. It was booming at this time. The Mission Network, especially at this time, had missions. Scientology has missions and then orgs and, then the Sea Org. So these lower level mission groups, which could deliver auditing up to the level of clear and minor training courses, they concentrated on the auditing. Some of these missions, and my parents at this time worked at the Pasadena mission, were delivering hundreds of hours of auditing a week and had packed course rooms. I was, like I said, 10 years old at this time, and I remember very clearly those times. And I wanted to make sure I got a note in here that Hubbard was always consistent through all the years of Dianetics and Scientology, through his lectures and his writings, that he was anti-tax, hated taxes, thought that it was outright theft, and that the government should never ever have passed income tax, and used some of that in his conspiracy theories that he formulated in the late 60s and promulgated through the 70s, that the bankers were the ones who were artificially messing with markets and messing with economies in order to advance their own personal agenda. And he even referred to one-worlders in some of his writings. And so the idea that, these guys were more powerful than all the governments and were, working on this. So his effort here is to finally get a line in to a president who he thought he could appeal to on this point of, establish a common reality on inflation. And I got an idea for you to deal with this and handle it and be, wildly successful as a president, and at the same time get a tremendous amount of personal benefit, L. Ron Hubbard would, because he had already amassed, millions of dollars in offshore accounts through the 70s. And he also at this time had just gone into hiding, I think I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons being tax evasion. So I just wanted to put all that context there, from Hubbard's point of view, as well as the bigger view that you guys just gave.